Hey, good morning, everybody. How are you today? I think one of the hallmark leadership traits of anybody that graduates CHDS is sometimes you get thrown a curveball. And you have to be able to transient fast, you know, John Boyd and OODA loops. And we got thrown a curveball, and our subject matter is still indicative of the macro we want to speak about. We're excited to share with it, but it's a little untraditional, and we're not asking for your forgiveness because we don't want it. We're just going to dazzle you with our brilliance. My name is Dan O'Connor. I am the National Security and Operations Division Director for FEMA.
My name is Katelin Wright. At my day job, I work for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services with Refugee International Operations, and on the side, I do everything involving climate security.
All right, and I'm Troy Christensen, very recent grad of the master's program, 2301, 2302. We have a big table in the back there. I'm also a federal emergency manager. I've been doing that for about 9 years, and prior to that, I was a meteorologist. So my undergraduate was in meteorology, did TV weather for many years before switching over. So kind of my specialty is talking the intersection between extreme weather, meteorology, science communication, and also just kind of all of the implications that brings.
So that's us. What we've done today, it's a little unusual. We have put together what we would call a workshop / maybe tabletop. We are 4 scenarios that have been built. Hopefully we can get through them, but they're based on the 4 ancient elements of fire, ice, water, and earth. And we're going to introduce some topics. We will talk amongst ourselves. The room prohibits probably some of the interaction we would hope for, but I would ask you to hold all questions till the end. We're going to try to leave as much time as we can for questions and answers, but I hope we are provocative, sincere, and strike the intellectual chord to the people in this room. So without further ado, we're going to start with sometime in September. September is for some of you in the Midwest understand, that's when we start to harvest wheat. But on September 13th, 2026, a element of the Northern Iowa Agricultural Zone started to see or understand rust blight of an unusual amount being found on our 2 main commoditized crops, corn and wheat. Now, the interesting part about this is all of our crops have been genetically modified. They're glyphosate proof, so they're Roundup ready. But a fungus was introduced into the space. We're not sure how it was introduced. It could have been introduced through migration patterns changing for birds. Could have been introduced over the Sahara with wind changes in the Gulf Stream. But 70% of our wheat and corn were destroyed within 60 days of its harvesting. If you know anything about wheat and corn, their primary purposes are for feed for animals. The requirement annually for wheat for consumption is about 896 million metric tons, and we only produce 790 metric tons. So we're always operating at a deficit. The primary producers of wheat in the world right now, number 1 is China, number 2 is Russia, and we are 3rd. So 2 of our key adversaries are our primary producers of wheat, and now we are in a position where we require their assistance. For those of you who remember this back in the 70s and early 80s, wheat was a commodity that could have been, based on your interpretation, weaponized to bring the Russians into the SALT agreements because they had also a wheat destruction blight that took out most of their crops and also we used it as a political weapon, even though that's illegal. So one of the concerns that we have is when the collapse begins, what does that do to the nation, to our soil, to our economic flights through our migrations pattern? And my first question to my panel member, Katelin, is what happens when there is a collapse of a food system, even in the United States?
So I think many of us can imagine this is there's going to be some conflict and violence. This is key resources. These are Maslow's hierarchy, right? Water, food, shelter. So if we don't have food, then we can anticipate that possibly black markets are going to start showing up, that non-state actors, maybe gangs, cartels, maybe they stop moving away from fentanyl, and now it is all of a sudden with food exports. And we've seen this. This isn't something new that we're seeing, something that's never occurred. We've seen this actually in places like Iraq with ISIS. They were weaponizing water. We've seen it as a recruitment mechanism for young children by non-state actors. When there is resource scarcity, groups weaponize it. And then if you are desperate enough, you are willing to, you can get radicalized. So I think we could see some really interesting dynamics in that regard. Is what happens when these resources become weaponized, and how does that look like for our law enforcement? What does that look like in terms of even borders for states? You know, we've been really focusing on the southern border, but in a scenario like this, we're not talking about people coming across the border. We're talking about people going across state borders, potentially seeking food. And what does that look like? And what about you, Troy? What are your thoughts on this? This is another hot topic.
I think the cascading impacts
Yeah.
to, you know, the scenario that we gave you has basically two crop types, right? So because that so much of that is used for feed, we're talking about, you'd be shocked at how many ingredients can really boil down to just a couple of food sources, especially when you talk about all of the livestock that use the feed. You know, all of the, it's just, I think that is one of the cascading things. The other thought that I had on this is, obviously, the Midwest is one of the bread baskets of the country, but it's not the only one. This scenario, even though it's a completely different scenario, kind of reminds me of the arc storm. Is anybody familiar with the arc storm scenario? So that's a scenario that is actually right here in California, where basically a series of atmospheric rivers over the course of months essentially turns Central California into a lake. And this is not some like far-flung scenario. Something similar to this happened. It just happened to be in 1862 when everybody was A, focused on the Civil War, and B, there were only 400,000 people that lived in the entire what is now California. But that would have been a multi-trillion-dollar disaster had that occurred today, and it's in all of these agriculture areas that are vital to not only agriculture here in California, but well beyond across the entire United States and the entire world. So, you know, I think it's really interesting to talk about cascading events because, you know, how will we react to the potential for these other scenarios to happen at the same time, which would even exacerbate an already dire situation when we're talking about people that are probably going to, you know, resort to, as things you were mentioning, violence and everything that's associated with that.
So there's a whole theme that runs through some of these scenarios is 9 meals to anarchy. And that if our just-in-time logistics system and chains and the lattice of interdependability that everything relies on everything at this point, and things are so tightly coupled that one failure within the system can crash the entire system. You saw elements of this during COVID. You had elements of the United States throws away, destroys, no longer requires anywhere between 39 and 50% of its food production. And yet we have large areas of the country that are undernourished or are food insecure. These kind of scenarios will exacerbate another form of issue, which is misinformation and disinformation, and how the government in some space is going to lead, manage, coerce, control states, tribal, territorial, local places. And also, how are we going to provide sustenance for the nation? Because crops have a growing season And even though we have NAFTA or USMC and we have interdependabilities with the Southern Hemisphere, that's one reason why we have watermelon and oranges in December, where it used to be a seasonal fruit. Our expectations for sustenance have grown to such a degree that any interruption, any perturbation will set off one of these cascades. And in that misinformation, disinformation space, is somebody going to introduce the idea or the ideas that this was not a natural phenomenon or occurrence, but was a weaponized bioterrorist activity? And then from that point, how do you deal with state law, federal law, moving from region to region, moving from class to class, the current tenuous environment with those who produce our food and bring our food to us? What does that feel like from your perspective?
So I think one of the things when I'm thinking of a scenario like this too is the geopolitical implications. So what you were talking about earlier, Dan, in this scenario is you were mentioning China and Russia being also key exporters of wheat and corn. So if all of a sudden we're taken out of that market, that's a soft power we have. We like to talk a lot about these hard powers when we're talking about homeland security, the military, DoD, but soft powers are a leverage point, especially when it comes to our international relations. So if all of a sudden these foods aren't being produced in America and going overseas, like to some of the, we could use, for example, like Africa, right? Or Southeast Asia that relies on these crops. Who is going to fill that vacuum? China, Russia. Why does that matter? Because if you look at the strategy of a place like China and look at their different plans with the Belt and Road Initiative, it is all about leveraging them into having as much influence as possible overseas. Now, I'm not just saying this like from doing the research. And I can say too, from traveling overseas and being in East Africa and even in El Salvador recently, we are seeing China's growing presence. Case in point, when I was in El Salvador recently, they just created this beautiful new library, soft power, right? China co-sponsored this library with the support of Bukele's government, and all they had to do was one thing. One thing. Anyone want to guess what that one thing was? Nope. They had to deny Taiwan's sovereignty. That was the only condition. And yet, the hearts and minds of Salvadorians are now going to be influenced by this library that was co-created by China and has its emblem on the outside of the library. So yes, we're talking about food here, but it is all part of a bigger picture, this inner lattice of what Dan is talking about and why we're talking about these types of scenarios. We can't think of the world in silos, and we have to start bridging these gaps amongst one another to figure out what is the bigger picture we're looking at here, and how can our adversaries take advantage of it. And perfect example, when the environment turns against us.
So before I kick it back over to Troy, just think of that in terms of what monocultures require. A monoculture requires a stable crop with more inputs to generate one kind of product. So when you interrupt 70% of the growth of corn and wheat in the United States, and it takes 6 months to a year, and you don't own the rights to that crop because it's been genetically modified and a patent is owned now on nature, and it has a suicide seed, which means you have to buy it again, and your crops have failed, the entire industrial agriculture industry is now operating at a deficit. So they are billions of dollars in debt because their crop hasn't been replenished to go to market, and how does that cascade into the economic sphere? The other part of this to consider, and I'd like Troy to unpack this a little bit more for us, is what happens when a large swath of agriculture, green space dies, and what happens to the soil and the micro weather that impacts that area?
I just, based on that exact question you asked, I think about the Dust Bowl. I mean, that's a perfect example because,
And we are in Steinbeck, so the.
yeah, exactly.
Grapes of wrath right here.
I hate to bring it in, but I mean, once you have the cover crop die, you have, you basically rid the entire environment of, first of all, the roots that suck up the water, so you have increased flooding. You have the potential for increased, dust storms because, that land is not held. I think eventually, after a couple of years, though, you actually have prairie regrowth, which actually is a resilience factor. But then you have to think about when you're trying to plant new plants eventually, having to, start from ground, from step one, which is incredibly time-consuming, costly. So the startup factor on being able to start creating or producing these crops again is going to be incredibly difficult as well.
Well, and the other part, to Troy's point, is it takes decades up to centuries to reproduce soil, topsoil. Soil is an organism with billions of organisms within it, and we have functionally destroyed the organism to turn soil into a substrate that is used to house fungicides, herbicides, and pesticides to grow these monocultures, which are Roundup ready. So we have put ourselves in such a position in terms of this space, this monoculture industrial food monolith, that we set ourselves up because the whole system is extremely brittle, it's fragile, can't be reproduced, and you have to then introduce technologies and knowledge that we no longer have. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means because less and less people work on farms. After World War II, the majority of the population left the farm and went into urban areas, used the GI Bill, all of these things in a historical context. So you have larger and larger industrial farm requirements that are driving a lot of the behavior. So there are only 4 meat producers in the United States. There are only 9 food producers in the United States. These are cascading mono systems that if one fails, they all fail. And if they all fail, there is not enough polyculture in the current infrastructure of the United States to manage the food requirements. Another thing to consider is you require bovine introduction to rehabilitate the soil. So the reason you have cow flatulence isn't because of cows, it's because you feed them corn, soybeans, and wheat, and that's not in their diet. A herbivore, horses and cows, convert grass into its basic structure of amino acids, and that's why they can grow eating grass. And their manure is so nutritionally dense in terms of nitrogen that that's where soil comes from. It regrows, and that's where earthworms come. So your biosphere can regrow, but it takes a lot of time, and it takes under evaluating what science tells us in terms of economic science, business, and what Joel Salatin, Alan Savory, Will Harris, and other people that are going backwards to move forwards. There's a study that came out in the last 4 or 5 years that 90% of the country could be fed within 100 miles of their homes. As we transition into the next scenario, this is exactly what happened in 1845 with the potato blight. So this is a real thing. This didn't just happen. It's not artificial. A monoculture, the potato, in a depressed and, depending on your perspective, oppressed area, was killed by a fungus that moved across the country or the ocean in a ship. And it hit the whole world. But the reason it didn't destroy Peru and other places was because they had varieties, they had biodiversity. In Ireland, they only had one, and then it was weaponized against them, and it's taken 150 years for Ireland's population to come back to where it was post-1845. So that's the genesis of this scenario. It can happen again. This is a homeland security issue because this is the first element of the Bella Vita triad: meta-hazard, meta-crisis, polycrisis. And we're now through the fall. We're hungry. Lots of the population of the world is starving because we have now an induced famine. And I'm going to kick it over to meteorologist Troy Christensen.
All right, so here's our next scenario. So again, cascading, not necessarily connected events, but cascading events that all impact all of these events that we're going to be talking about here this morning. So here's the scenario number 2. It is New York's infrastructure crisis in the winter of 2026, and we call this one the frozen collapse. First of all, I know everybody's heard of polar vortex. On behalf of meteorologists everywhere, I'm really sorry we introduced that to the general population. Polar vortex, the entire idea of it has been around since weather theory started, probably close to 100 years ago, and we started understanding, we just understood the world around us a little bit better. But polar vortex slipped out of some meteorologist's mouth on TV probably about 10 years ago now, and the rest is history. And now, everybody thinks that a polar hurricane is going to be bearing down on their house. So, but this particular scenario, after several consecutive mild winters, the winter of 2026 struck with an unexpected and brutal intensity. Driven by multiple polar vortices, the season becomes the 4th coldest in 75 years, plunging vast portions of the United States into a deep freeze. The extreme cold, coupled with heavy snow and ice storms, crippled major cities, with New York City actually seeing the biggest impact from this. So, in addition to that impact, the power infrastructure, which has already been weakened by years of deferred maintenance, political gridlock, aging transmission lines, faces a unprecedented test. So basically the energy demand surged and the system ultimately failed. So imagine a grid failure in the middle of a polar vortex in New York City. And the thing about a polar vortex, I know most folks from the Midwest at least will be able to understand this. It's not a small, it's cold in this very small area. The polar vortex is essentially one of the, is basically the cell that's usually sits at the poles. And as the jet stream weakens, it kind of fluctuates. And sometimes it fluctuates way further south than it typically is. And that's kind of the scenario we're talking about here because there's going to be some things that happen in New York City, but I can guarantee you that if New York City is under a polar vortex, a good chunk of the Florida citrus crop will also die. There will be impacts that are way beyond the Northeast, although with this scenario being a power outage scenario, that's kind of where we're focused here. But the thing about the polar vortex, it's not just the cold. People think that that is the big story, and it is in some areas. But polar vortex essentially is a change in the jet stream. So this pushes the jet stream much further south than usual. This is where we saw the events that happened in Texas with the power outages, snow in New Orleans, all of these kind of, everybody says wacky weather events that happen in the South. A lot of them are really actually kind of correlated to some of those things. So I guess my first question, I'll send it to you first. What are your thoughts on kind of where you see this scenario going, knowing that suddenly a good chunk of New York is plunged into darkness when it's potentially 20 degrees below zero?
Right. So who in my audience does emergency management? All right. Law enforcement, border, immigration.
Who's just here because they're cool? All right.
Okay, that's Dan only. That would be him, right? So, this one, what I immediately think is, what do we do as humans when our environment is inhospitable? We move. It's pretty easy, right? This is a normal adaptive measure. We move. So, why I asked who's in the audience is because when people move, things get interesting. So if we're talking about the population a good chunk of it from New York moving. Well, we know in migration studies that usually it's stepwise migration. They're going to go to neighboring cities. They're going to now start putting a lot of pressure on those social services. My LE, you're going to all of a sudden start dealing with people you've never seen in your community before. You don't know what their needs are. Now you've got to deal with that. Then we have the social services. Where is the housing going to be for these people? Driving up the market prices on housing, rental, and we've seen these sort of things happen before. We can even think, now here's the other scenario, is we can think about what just recently has been happening down at the southern border. People like Governor Abbott has been sending migrants up to places like New York City and Chicago. And look at what that has resulted in. But in this scenario, these are US citizens. This is what we call internal migration and what we call forced displacement. And what happens in these scenarios is that people will probably likely go back to New York, but some may permanently move. And as you thinking about your local communities, thinking about your local cities, the question becomes, what if you have a huge influx of people from another area of the country? How do you meet their needs? What do you do with the conflict over limited resources? Because remember, we still have this crop and wheat blight going on top of this, right? This is a multi-layered scenario. Those food restrictions haven't stopped. They're in addition to this polar vortex. And so, Dan, as an emergency manager and everything you've done with FEMA, how do you see this in some terms of different implications?
So there's multi-layered and multi-tiered concerns, because here's why. Bayonne, New Jersey, which is across the Hudson River, is the largest container shipping port on the East Coast. So if there's no power and there's no storage, the two greatest inventions in the last 150 years have been electricity and refrigeration. So if your food that you already don't have is coming from other places and there's no electricity and it spoils and you can't grow it and it's cold and you've been cold for 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 months, you're going to want to relocate. The challenge in relocating in the 21st century is there's not an industrial revolution like there was in the previous great migrations of the United States, both in terms of the Dust Bowl and the great migration from the South, because that was driven by industry and opportunity, and that came out of global world war. We don't have that manufacturing infrastructure anymore, and it becomes a class issue in terms of financial capability to move from one space to another space. So you are paralyzed by your economic situation. That's a reality. And in this particular instance, I would argue that those that Governor Abbott sent to New York were not part of the tax base. Citizens within Texas or New York are part of the tax base, and the more that exports, revenue goes down, services go down, and these are one of those cascading effects that you have to consider, especially in the greater New York area. The greater metropolitan area has 25 million people in it.
I think one of the big things as well, even the logistics of talking about moving that many people in this scenario are almost impossible because, yes, you may have fuel, but almost every gas station relies on an electric pump for that fuel to go into your car. So there's that. The other thing that I'm thinking about, assuming that this, and I should have said this up front, but we're assuming this is a long-term power outage. This is not something that's resolved, by switching it back on and unplugging it and plugging it back in. So
pressing the reset button.
One of the biggest things that we've seen recently in large-scale disasters in which we have a loss of power for a long time is the connection with communication. So cell phones, even if you have a battery pack, you might get you an extra day or two. There are so many services that are dependent on your cell phone that have nothing to do with communication. Think about two-factor authentication. We've seen this in every disaster that I've worked at recently. This has been a huge factor because people don't have access to their money if it involves them logging in. They don't have access to their accounts. They don't have access to their information. And I'm not saying two-factor authentication is bad, but in a case like this, when a lot of your resources may be locked up in your phone somewhere and you don't have that money to be able to evacuate, you don't have the resources to get to a warmer location. And we haven't even talked about just the immense amount of damage, like what happened in Texas, when pipes break and it's 20 below, and we're talking about people moving because it is uninhabitable in their house, not necessarily just because that power goes out. So I think there's a couple.
So that's a critical point. So depending on where you get your research, America universally scores a C- or below on the annual infrastructure report card. Depending how you do the math, we have between $58 to $158 trillion of deferred maintenance. I know Tank could probably talk to this a bit, but there are actually wooden pipes in Boston and New York lined with creosote that continues to move water to critical spaces and people. When you neglect infrastructure, the price is exponential. For every dollar you invest in critical infrastructure maintenance, you get a $4 return. So imagine the amount of neglect that is taking place to have a $158 trillion deficit. This is critical in these conversations, because when things are neglected and they're not winterized and you take things for granted and you push it down away from you, because in our brains, this is a monumental problem, but it's not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. And this is the problem of a lifetime. Well, some of us here have about 2 minutes left of life, 2 weeks, 2 years. The human condition thinks in very small terms, 75 years. Well, these are 250-year problems in the making. And critical infrastructure is laid after urbanization. So it's an inverse proportion. All of these things we take for granted, and we always seem to find the money to fix them, but we really don't fix them. We just put them kind of back to the way they were. And these are all the cascading consequences in this emerging polycrisis, that the lattice of interdependence, one thing can affect everything, and our need for comfort and simplicity has actually made us really fragile.
And with that regard too, let's talk about one of the most boring things, but not something we pay enough attention to, and I think until recently. How many of y'all have homeowners insurance? Yeah, I do, right? So if some place becomes uninhabitable, or possibly like you do want to rebuild, here's the thing. People like State Farm, companies like State Farm, they're leaving high-risk areas. That's what we've just seen in the Palisades. A lot of those homes, we're talking multi-million-dollar homes, lost homeowners insurance, and then had to go under the high-risk insurance California Fair Plan. California Fair Plan doesn't have the money to rebuild all those homes. So whether we're talking about New York, we're talking about Lincoln, Nebraska, in this crop famine. Here's the thing, it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to keep their homeowners insurance. And I don't know about you, but that's where a lot of us have our equity. So all of a sudden you lose your home, how the heck, one, are you going to rebuild, if it's even possible to rebuild? We know that FEMA, now I'm no FEMA expert like these two gentlemen next to me, but I do know enough to know that, you get 30K max if it's completely lost. Is that correct?
I can neither confirm nor deny.
All right, fair enough. I'll take it.
She's trying to get us into trouble.
Okay, all right, fair enough. I'm not. It's my naivety, okay? This is what happens when you're CIS. We don't talk about these things. But bottom line is, 30K ain't gonna get you much in terms of rebuilding. And we are creating this cycle where people are moving to higher, riskier areas, but they're not thinking about equity in their homes and what happens if it's lost, and then also property taxes. How many of you rely on those for your bottom line? So insurance, highly boring for some of us, but you should be thinking about it when we're thinking about these scenarios, because guess what? When we think resilience, I know myself for one, I think of resilience, hey, I can rebuild because I have homeowners insurance. You take that off the table, and all of a sudden, communities are far less resilient. And how does that look when we move into other
Yeah,
scenarios?
And that's that derivative of moral hazard, because I don't have to worry about it, someone else is going to pay. And if you have $250 billion in damage in California, and you don't realize that in 2018, 2019, and 2020, $25 billion in lumber were destroyed with 3 hurricanes, and it takes 25 to 70 years to regrow that lumber, you're going to have a Hunger Games for materials to rebuild these houses. Where does that material come from? Does it come from China with the nematode buried in the wood by accident, and we have something else? That's another, that's scenario 6.
He wanted to go down that path too. Then I was
No,
like,
but
come on, Dan.
All of these things, while they seem intangible and unrealistic, they're part of a planning process that you have to consider in this poly crisis that we find ourselves. So we've gone through summer, we're through the winter, and now we have Fuego.
And now we have Fuego, and this is going to probably sound a little reminiscent, but I think it is very timely. So let's talk through this scenario. So just to recap, we've got America, a lot of the world under hunger. We've just had this polar vortex electrical grid, very messed up for a lot of the northeast of the country. And now we're looking to the west in California. And we've had unforgiving heat of a record-breaking California summer. And what happens is the worst wildfire. Now, here's the interesting part. It's unclear exactly how this wildfire started. It might have been a defunct US satellite past its operational life that just fell out of the sky. We've seen this. This just actually happened in Kenya not that long ago. Might have been a commercial satellite that was misidentified as hostile and suffered an unplanned deorbit. Or maybe it was a Chinese surveillance balloon drifting unnoticed for weeks. Doesn't that sound familiar? That had lost altitude and crashed in the worst possible location. Bottom line, doesn't matter. The fact is, it has ignited this huge fire that has resulted in 750,000 acres in just 2 weeks. Sounds pretty familiar to some of these things. But the media now has really taken up the idea, was this preventable? And who is responsible? And was this an attack on US soil? And what should we do? So let's talk about this scenario, considering all the other things that are already going on in America. What are some of the things that you're thinking of, Dan, along these lines?
In the current context, I'm currently thinking that I'm supporting 100 federally declared disasters simultaneously.
Yes.
I am dealing with political fallout, which is a reality. Things are changing. Leadership requirements are flexing. We have a overworked response and recovery community. There is no funding. Congress is deadlocked. We're coming up on a continuing resolution. And since we have just come through a really dynamic political event with an election, I'm fighting misinformation, disinformation. I have activity that I am aware of that is taking place in Iran, China, Russia, and India that are botting us to death with misinformation, changing the conversation from the fact of the fire to who's responsible, and that this is all a plot. And this is all going on simultaneously, and the information cycle usurps our ability in an analog space because we're trying to answer questions instead of trying to get in front of the information operation. Because all of these, if you haven't seen this transition, are no longer about this simple emergency. Everything we do moving forward will be an information operation. And we're being exploited by our adversaries because our over-reliance on technology and information, we don't know what's real anymore. We don't know what's authentic. And in layman's terms, we're being played, and we are responding to things that aren't real, which takes our cognitive load or our cognitive surplus that Angie was talking about, and we've shifted the focus from solutions to blame. And that is a time continuum to, it's much like a sniper in traditional warfare, it's harassment. And in that harassment, you change your behavior to take your focus off the primary need, which are the people that are affected.
And I think one of the really interesting things about this scenario when you talk about the wildfire is there are so many other cascading events, some very predictable and some not so predictable. So like the predictable ones, unfortunately, we just saw in Southern California over the last few days with the mudslides, flood after fire, very, very common if you get a wildfire just because of what the fire does to the soil and the vegetation around it. Very, very common, especially in areas that have any amount of terrain. And even some areas that are pretty flat still see, those mudslides. But there's also, I think, one of the things here is also the medical, just when you put your medical hat on here and you talk about smoke from fires. Obviously, and I know all the firefighters in the audience will know, smoke inhalation is bad, and that's a big thing. But, I mean, if you look back to the Canadian wildfires a couple of years ago, large swaths of Canada were on fire, at approximately the same time. That smoke made it to the Midwest, even made it to the East Coast. And we saw a noticeable number of increased ER visits. People with comorbidities, people with asthma, COPD, those types of ailments because of fires that were happening 2,000 miles away. So it's not necessarily, these cascading events are not necessarily easy ones to kind of wrap your head around, but that's something that has happened, on multiple fire events, including the latest one in Southern California. So I think that's a big thing. The scenario started with extreme heat, which is what I wrote my thesis on, so I'm particularly interested there. But extreme heat in and of itself does not have a lot of cascading scenarios that make sense. Yes, wildfires happen after extreme heat events. That's been pretty proven. But if you look at the Midwest, there's actually an increase in the frequency of major flooding events right after extreme heat events conclude. So again, not necessarily intuitive. I mean, from a meteorological sense, it makes sense because extreme heat, with more heat, there's more moisture that can be held in the air and all of those types of things. But it really depends on where you are in the country, on how some of these cascading events actually play out.
And to your point with public health, I think another thing to consider, and this is something I have learned from the students I've taught with emergence, is when we're talking about fire too, we have to consider the pre-existing environmental, social, and political implications of that area. So case in point, if there are prior mining towns that happen to catch on fire, what are certain chemicals that are being put into the atmosphere? I believe it was a Yellowknife, I could be wrong, fire that happened, and it was putting out lots of toxic fumes as part of that fire. And just recently, while it was not as highly publicized as the Palisades fire, here in California, there has been a huge movement to green energy. Great, love it. But here's the problem, you have to have somewhere to store that energy. Where do we store it? Lithium batteries. Firefighters in the room, what happens when a lithium battery storage catches on fire? What do you all do? Let it burn, right? That's the way I understand it. So these are the complexities that, okay, we can talk just about fire, but we have to start taking into consideration these other pre-existing environmental, social, and political things. So California, in its endeavor to be more green, to adopt these good other ways of energy diversification, there are still elements to be considered, and one of those being, what do we do when a lithium battery supplier catches fire? We just have to let it burn. And then what are the toxins that are being released as a result of that?
And I think when you unpack it in certain ways, the social toll is immeasurable. So what do I mean by that? So if you spend any time in special operations and combat, and also you're starting to really see it in firefighting and also law enforcement, is the allostatic load of stress. The allostatic load of stress is over an extended period of time. Your mitochondria, your behavior, your biology is changing because of the chronic levels of information and stress based on your environment. So imagine a population of 336 million that's been felled by a third because of a set of conditions, probably a little fictional, but millions of people will be starting to die in these spaces. You saw the effect of tens of thousands of people dying during COVID in New York City, and the American psyche in a post-literate world where all their information is provided topically and superficially by what would be other media forms are being conditioned, for lack of a better word, to pray at the altar of convenience, and we're not accustomed, nor are we resilient enough for what we're going through. So a lot of adaptation will be taking place, and we will be resilient on the back end of this. But I don't know if we ever try to capture or evaluate the energy required for cooling places in heat domes, for the water requirements for fires, for the fuel necessary to transport A to B. All of these third, fourth, fifth, sixth order of effects in a just-in-time economy, they're not captured for, and because there's no surplus, because we don't warehouse well, it's not cost efficient. These will all be activities that we will have to embrace and understand, and we don't do it well anymore. It's not to say that we can't do it well, but our economy has changed, our expectations have changed, our production has changed, and invariably we are changing.
And the other thing is, I think now that we're 3 scenarios in, and you touched on this a little bit, Dan, we talked about all of the connections, but at this point, you got to think like the general public here. These may be 3 completely separate things, but they're connecting all these dots, and the dots are saying this leads to this leads to this. My biggest pet peeve with anything social media is I just want to reply to everybody. Correlation is not causation. I just want to reply it everywhere. I wish that was taught to my kindergartner at school, because that is those are the crucial things that I think we are lacking when we talk about, especially it's just so difficult in science communication to convey that point without being preachy. And, talking a little bit more about communication, since that's really my day job is external affairs, public affairs, we started trying to communicate at a 6th grade level. Well, that's down from an 8th grade level, but as you continue to lower that, it becomes simpler, like you do this, you do that. Well, the side effect of that, we're finding out now, it seems very like you do this, you do that, I'm the government and I'm telling you this is what you need to do. So it's actually having the reverse effect compared to the problem we're trying to solve, which is to make something easy and simplistic and have a large swath of the audience able to understand it. So I think at this point of our scenario, now that we're 3 unprecedented events in, is that there's going to be so much rampant mis and disinformation that even the great messages coming out from the public sector will not really garner any attention at all.
And I think that's one of the critical things to evaluate. So in 1947, when the Security Act was written, the Department of Defense was formed, and the purpose was we had to be able to fight 2 simultaneous world wars. And that's how the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Navy were built. All these things, the expectation, the costs, et cetera. Is that model still effective? So invert that expectation to we have currently 100 federally declared disasters. These are small skirmishes in a metaphor. What's our breaking point? What's our breaking point in terms of service expectations and service providers? And in that service provision spot, when do we change our behavior? Because we're $58 trillion in debt, and we've talked about that. But we also have fiat currency. We can print our own money, but are also the default currency of the globe. Well, what if China decides to undermine that, or the dollar collapses and the petrodollar is no longer the default currency? That adds a astronomical quantifying factor that as planners and emergency managers and people in this space that you talk about. But when do we start making it actionable? And in that actionable part, and in that debt part, and in that all of these spaces, our leadership is going to change, and our leadership expectations are going to change. And we've already had one or two of these things happen near simultaneously. So are we further away from this potential polycrisis dystopia, or is it going slow enough that we haven't recognized that we're in it? And what's next? So the what's next, this is called our speed round. Though it's not likely, we don't know when it's going to happen. What if we have a Carrington event? What if we have a coronal mass ejection, which is equivalent to an EMP, that only blasts half the world and sets down our entire infrastructure and shuts down our electricity, and it takes decades, if not centuries, to rebuild. And we're pushed back into the 1850s in terms of technology and availability. Now, people are going to say, no, we're prepared for this, we're hardened for this, but I would argue that we're not, because it's not real enough. You know, Y2K was real enough that we spent billions and billions of dollars in 1999 and nothing happened, and that's our memory bank. Well, nothing happened. Well, we've had Carrington events before. Now, it's 150, 160 years ago, and we've seen elements of EMP activity, and the EMP Commission, I think it was in 2009 or 2014, said if the United States was hit with an EMP, 90% of our population would die in a year. So when you start weighing these things and you start looking at the catastrophic capabilities of our adversaries, our inability to maintain our infrastructure, our inability to decentralize our requirements, strengthen our economy, and do all of these things together, I would say that the answers to these problems lies within this room, but who's asking the right questions? So if we had this scenario, it's kind of you and me till it's you or me, right? So what happens in New Mexico when 5,000 people from Arizona try to cross the border?
We just simply don't have the infrastructure for it. I mean, this is, and I think this gets to some of the arguments that are being made now, is that, oh, states should just handle it. And I think there is some credence to that, but it depends on the state's infrastructure. A state like New Mexico, you know, over 50% are on Medicaid. We are not we rank 50th. I know this because I'm from New Mexico. We rank 50th in education. We just simply do not have the infrastructure to deal with a large mass movement of people. And I think this really gets back to the idea of planned relocations in general, which we can all the way pivot back to the very first scenario. Really, when you think about it, when we had the Dust Bowl, that was unplanned relocation. So one of the things that has been posited, well, let's do planned relocations. Let's move entire communities. But here's the thing. There is no centralized federal agency that's in charge of that. So we can look at Newtek, Alaska, or Isle de Jean Charles as an example. What happens? They're hit with an emergency. They have a hurricane. There's shore erosion. FEMA comes in, throws money at the problem. State comes in, throws money at the problem. It has taken, for Isle de Jean Charles, over 10 years to permanently relocate that community, and Newtek, Alaska, over 20. These are teeny tiny communities. When it's unplanned relocation, then there is no sort of planning that goes in. People just start showing up. And there is a study out there if you're so inclined, you can see it, is in Syria, looking at the civil war. One of the tipping points that was looked at is how the drought forced more people, it was a multiple-year drought, forced more people into urban areas, and then this helped inflame the violence and conflict that then further exacerbated and then culminated in the Civil War. So I see potential state-on-state violence here, and then I see hardening of borders. Alaska might become the prime real estate. Maybe you're from Montana. What if a bunch of people start showing up in your state? You don't let them across that border? What if I'm a US citizen? All of a sudden, these social constructs of what borders are take on very new meaning. Or maybe Alaska just decides we're going to secede from the state. So kind of went a little off on that one, but these are things to think about. And for those of you at the community level, this is why it's so important to know the needs of your community. That is where there is advantage to grassroots-led initiatives. The federal government will never understand the needs of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the way someone like Jackie would, who has worked there for years and was Homeland Security Secretary. So, and Troy, who lives in Los Alamos. So that would be my argument on that one. This darn Carrington event, he wanted this thing so much in this scenario.
I think the interesting thing about this event, though, is a Carrington event probably would not be a worldwide event. So you have whichever side of the world is facing the sun is going to be receiving the impact. So if that's the United States, which we're talking about here, there is going to be a mass migration to the extent possible for all of the people who have the means to leave. And they can easily go to the other side of the world and take their money with them, if it exists, and continue living their life. Or alternatively, you could replace almost all the electronics in the United States and go back to a somewhat, normal lifestyle. But that, going back to talking about taking time, that's, a decades-long process you're talking about. Plus, you have all of the other international relations questions with computer chips and all of the other things that you can talk about as well.
Who makes all the transformers in the world?
China, with rare earth minerals. China does 90% of rare earth minerals, which we are using in our phones, in our computers. These are all points that it's so easy for us within our field. We're all experts in our field to become hyper-focused on what's in front of us and our community's needs and nothing else. But we have to be at least taking these other things into consideration so we're not blindsided by the future. We can't just rely on the past as an indicator of what's coming in the future years.
You can go from failure to success, but you can't go from excuse to success. And I think sometimes we're too busy making excuses instead of trying to create solutions. America used to have a very strong tinkering community, repair culture, tinkering culture. That's where our innovation and creativity came from. We built things, we did things. So if we're going to have these kind of conversations and questions about adaptation and resilience and economics, is it in our best interest to reevaluate how we do things, why we do things, and prepare for the future? Because presently, given these scenarios, which are not unlikely, and we've experienced one or two, what are our expectations? And from my perspective, that's why we started with the interdependence, this lattice thing. Everybody in this room is connected. Yesterday was great for me. Owen West's dad fought in Vietnam with my father-in-law, and they've been friends for 65 years. It's weird. And I haven't seen Owen West in 25 years, but I knew who he was and he knew I was because we're connected. All of you are connected in some form or fashion. It came up in this morning in Greg's conversation. How do we exploit each other? By definition, the network. Because you'll learn more about networks tomorrow with John Robb. When the network flexes, solutions emerge. So if you always do what you've always did, you'll always get what you always got. These emerging convergence issues will create new problems, and we're not going to solve them with the same thinking that put us in the problem. So this is an opportunity from our perspective to just think a little differently, ask questions. It was born out of, again, the pivot from our first task to the second task. Security is a state, it's a state of mind, it's a state of being, it's an equilibrium. And how we maintain that equilibrium to make sure that we, as Americans and the United States, maintain our place in the world and the quality of life that we expect, but also we owe it to the future because those who came before us did it for us. So that's our pitch. I asked you to hold.
Should we introduce our fourth member?
Oh, yes, our fourth member, I forgot. Our fourth member is the unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know. It's one of Donald Rumsfeld's greatest contributions to mankind. There are things we don't know, and there are things we don't know we don't know. And our fourth member of the panel is, we don't know. But admitting you don't know is the first step in starting down that process to learning, communicating, sharing, being vulnerable, being open to new ideas. Because 90 days ago, I had never spoken to Katelin, and now we're like buds, because we talked about other things. This is where it happens. This is the solution incubator, and that's what we have. So any questions?